Okay.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the elusive show that I occasionally run when I have time to read, which is Prudent Reads episode number 6. Today we will be talking about Barry Posen's Restraint, a new foundation for U.S. grand strategy. And today joining me on our episode of Prudent Reads is Mr. Raging Mandrill himself, the gentleman who recommended this book to me in the first place so many months ago. Mr. Mandrill, how are you?
Hello. I'm doing very well, thank you.
So, today we actually get to talk about a foreign policy book for the first time in a long time on this show. We've discussed some previous works in the past, such as Clash of Civilizations. But this time we're actually going to talk about some of the nitty-gritty aspects of American foreign policy. And I think the most important part when it comes to this book is the time it was written. So this is a book from a time that feels like forever ago. So this was originally published in 2014, when it seemed to be that every foreign policy walk on Earth was focused on the domestic side, or the looking inward and this sort of retraction from the globe. This was a time when Council of Foreign Relations President Richard Haass published a book called Foreign Policy Begins at Home, talking about getting America's fiscal house in order, dealing with immigration, dealing with our defense budget, as a way to have a stronger foreign policy abroad. So now we're also talking about Mr. Barry Posen, and the outline for today's discussion on this book is going to be a little bit about Mr. Posen himself, the political environment, the geostrategic environment of 2014, and then we're going to dive into what the book actually calls for, which, if you can tell by the title, is Restraint, a little more of an inward push and a more focus on our regional allies and defense autonomy. But with that being said, Mr. Posen is a Ford International Professor of Political Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the director of MIT's Security Studies program. He leads sort of as the expert in the field when it comes to security studies and what American policy should look like. We're talking about a very well-credentialed man, someone within the university system, and somebody that we would typically call the establishment, or someone that is a part of academia. But in this book, he is very clear in his objections to the liberal, universalist, and interventionist policies that we typically, see as the foreign policy establishment. And for those of you who are wondering, yes, Mr. Posen is indeed a realist, someone whose views that are very similar to myself and Mr. Mandrill's as well. In fact, his doctoral advisor was Kenneth Waltz, one of the most important realist scholars of the 20th century, and towards the 1980s and 90s, was the founding scholar for defensive realism in the neo-realist school. So he's written for a variety of pieces, not only his own books, but he's written for the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the American Interest. And so with that, and this book is the main argument that we're talking about, is the idea that America's current foreign policy of allies simply having an easy ride, making it more likely for Americans to be having their taxpayer dollars being spent on its defense budget and being engaged in the local politics of other countries, needs to come to an end. And that, my friends, is going to be the thesis that we explore today in the book. But Mr. Mandrill, like I mentioned in our opening today, was that this was written at what it feels like an entirely different foreign country, the United States, published in 2014. And I think that we should probably contextualize that first before getting to the book itself.
Yes, totally agree. As we were saying before, this is before Trump, so this book, reading it now, has the feel of being from the before times. Although you can definitely see with that style of Trumpian foreign policy of trying to get your allies to pay their fair share, you can kind of see a lot of those elements in it. But from a perspective of circa before Trump, this is like almost a bombshell of that's rocking the boat of the foreign policy establishment. So it's very fascinating as a read.
Yeah, I mean, and this read, of course, is very similar in the ways that would echo a lot of the things that Trump talks about. Especially within the book, there's a lot of calls for European defense autonomy and making sure that NATO allies and European partners to the United States are actually paying the necessary 2 to 2.5% of their GDP towards defense rather than relying on the United States. So there's a lot in here that certainly echoes a lot of what we would later see come the rhetoric of 2016 and the early parts of the Trump administration when it came to NATO and Europe, especially. There are some things, however, that I don't think Barry could foresee when we were talking about the world of 2014. There's a section in the book that we'll dive deep into that was talking about America's relationship with, its Asiatic partners like South Korea and Japan, and the discussion over Taiwan. And he is openly critical as a realist, talking about the Obama administration's pivot to Asia. And he says that it's very reminiscent to Cold War containment strategy with the Soviet Union. And at the time, 2014, he argues that one day this may be necessary, but at the same time, it is not it's not necessary right here and now in 2014. And I think with hindsight, we can look in the last 7 years and say that, this posturing of containment has led to Asiatic pushback from China and states of influence that it now has regionally. Although he does make several other analysis in regards to the Chinese Navy and its policy as a land, oriented country more so than a naval one. But we'll dive into that as we go on. So the first part of this book, when they talk about the current liberal project from the fall of the Soviet Union onward. And if you've listened to this channel any length of time, there's quite a few things that Mr. Posen talks about in this book that I've also echoed as well. And so the first thing that he really starts breaking down is the history of how we got to this, idea of what he calls liberal hegemony. Now, of course, there's reference to Roosevelt, there's reference to Wilsonian idealism, but he's focusing more so on what we would call our contemporary history of American internationalism, specifically along the lines of post-fall of the Soviet Union, or specifically around the discussion of German reunification and NATO expansion. The United States at the time makes us several series of promises. In exchange for German reunification, there's not going to be this expansion of NATO towards, Russia's borders, and we're not going to try our best to absorb former Soviet republics. And in doing so, the fall of the Soviet Union comes in 91 on December 26th, and the Washington Consensus immediately begins to start reneging on said promises. So from, the end of the Cold War to, even present day, there has been numerous more admissions to the NATO states. There has been numerous more expansions of the European Union ever so closer to what are, iridescent territorial claims of the Russian Federation, causing significant problems. And in doing so, our policy of one, getting involved in the internal politics of various countries, whether that be with the Bosnia situation in the 90s, the issue of Somalia during the Clinton administration, and now more recently, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, have illustrated that this policy is not effective. In fact, one of the biggest things that he makes a comparison to is that from 2003 to 2011, when America officially withdrew, offensive forces into Iraq, we had spent more in 2011 dollars in Iraq than we did during the entirety of the Vietnam War. And he points out that this is not a very cost-effective measure, not only for the taxpayer, but in addition to the fact that it has not won us any allies or favorability in terms of state and international security. And I think that's a really good way to transition in this critique, is that his argument for restraint is based on a very narrow definition of grand strategy for the United States. And I know Mr. Mandrill and I were talking about this earlier, so Mandrill, do you have any thoughts on his definition for grand strategy?
Well, actually, first of all, I would like to just to remind everybody on the Obama-era administration pivot towards Asia. I just want to give everybody a quick reminder about what exactly that entailed, and just so everybody's aware, that was basically essentially on a naval level, the redeployment of naval forces from the east coast of the United States to Asia, and specifically redeploying more assets to be forward deployed in various places across the world, but especially in Asia. So I just wanted to start off with that little tidbit. That's like 60% in Asia and 40% on the East Coast. That's the ratio that President Obama chose to implement.
And we haven't left it since. If anything, we've put far more attention towards Asia, especially with our carrier strike groups. There has been a lot more ways to renew sort of the Anglospheric relationship between the United States, the UK, and Australia. All of which, of course, are focusing on sea power in that area. And something, of course, which Posen makes significant reference to throughout this book that we'll talk about as we go on. But yeah, that's one of the biggest things that we're going to talk about is going to be the pivot of Asia and the focus on sea power, because those two are inherently related to Posen's book. But in regards to grand strategy, Posen makes a very careful and narrow definition for grand strategy, which is sort of the mechanism of how a state preserves its security, its territorial, sovereignty, and a way to ensure it has the means to protect itself.
Correct. And I have the quote here. He says in his introduction, "A grand strategy is a nation-state's theory about how to produce security for itself."
Very sentence, very straightforward.
Yes, exactly. I like it. Simplicity is good.
But yeah, so with this narrow definition, he argues that sort of the overarching American presence abroad is not as necessary to meet the definition of ways to preserve itself. And in fact, he's arguing, I think, in a very Kenneth Waltz fashion from a defensive realist perspective, in part because he is arguing for increased autonomy between nation states, the recognition that a numerous amount of our relationship to countries are going to be mainly what he calls, buck riding and buck passing. They're not necessarily focusing their own military spending on themselves. They're more reliant on the United States to take care of its problem. And in fact, the United States reinforces this problem by incorporating new allies with weaker and weaker militaries, especially in Eastern Europe, to be under the American defense umbrella. And along with that is this position that really the only thing that is going to matter in terms of deployments are going to be a focus on Eurasia, which would require a strong naval presence in order for rapid deployment. But outside of that, he argues for a significant reduction in the size of the army. So we're seeing a lot of influence in defensive posturing and a lot of influence on sort of the Alfred T. Mahan sort of view of naval power above all, because no army can survive a blockade. So there's a lot of traditional foreign policy thinking, at least when it comes to defense strategy, that comes out of this book. And he's made numerous talks. I had made a video, or I posted a video on Twitter earlier, and I shared it on the channel and community tab, where Posen himself is talking about it. He says, look, the United States has two rather compliant neighbors to the north and south. We are still relatively protected from land invasion because of two large oceans. From a geographic perspective, there are things that the United States does not necessarily need to be involved in every part of the world. And that sort of begins this criticisms in the second chapter, which is the case for restraint, where he sort of breaks down the problems that come with this liberal hegemony project the United States has been pursuing as this attempt to be a unipolar power post-fall of the Soviet Union. And he's recognizing that even now in 2014, when this book was written, that this isn't going to be the case at all, as nations are beginning to redevelop their military powers, such as China, such as Russia. And it leaves us in a quandary because the more that you are likely to pursue this interventionist policy, the more likely you are to pursue this military, posturing, all that you are encouraging is the security dilemma. And I think that's a really good way for us to start off there, is sort of what makes the case for restraint. Because a lot of the things he's complaining about in 2014 are still happening to this day, both under the Trump and Biden administration.
Yes, that's a very astute observation. The biggest thing with the Trump administration, I found, with a lot of and implementing a lot of the stuff that Barry Posen was talking about is I felt like Trump had to make at least some sort of peace offering, or he felt like he had to make some sort of peace offering to the foreign policy establishment in Washington. And I'm I obviously don't think that worked out well for him. But there's another thing I had to talk about real quick about the shifting of military forces and resources into which specific type of force. You sent me a link for that Barry Posen talk earlier, and I watched that, and I found Barry's opinion on the purpose of the Marine Corps a bit interesting. Like, he doesn't really seem to know what the purpose of the Marine Corps in the Pacific would be. And I would say that, I mean, the purpose of the Marine Corps is as an exclusively amphibious force, really. So if you're island hopping in the Pacific, that's essentially what you'd use the Marine Corps for. Further, from a naval perspective, I'm definitely in favor of that as a Navy man myself. So the foreign policy reshifting here is basically saying, okay, we're going to restructure our military forces, so we're going to put more money into ships and things like the Marine Corps and the Air Force, right? So we can actually defend against a power in Asia, or basically defend your border through naval power, because you don't have any serious land threats. So, and obviously that means that you're going to downsize your army, really. So what else is there to say about that? That's pretty much it in a nutshell, really.
Yes, I wholeheartedly would agree there on bringing up those points. And I think that this allows us to begin sort of highlighting the criticisms that Posen brings out. And there are a couple of selections that I wanted to read rather quick, because there's one point that he's talking about in regards to the present problems in liberal hegemony, the first part of the book. He says, liberal hegemony is a costly, wasteful, and self-defeating grand strategy. The strong inherent security position of the United States makes it unnecessary. The United States has spent vast sums to sustain an omnidirectional reactionary military superiority. The United States has endeavored to reassure wealthy and prosperous allies that to deter former, present, and potential future adversaries, it has waged war to reorganize the internal politics of other states, usually weak ones that constituted little threat to the United States or its interests. Liberal hegemony is not making the United States more secure. The huge global military presence and the frequent resort to force produces several unfortunate outcomes, end quote. And I think that that's a really interesting way to highlight a problem that many on the right have identified as a problem, is that the United States' persistent omnidirectional presence, a way to react against anyone that wishes to oppose it, either culturally or militarily, and most importantly, economically, is some of the major threats that people like Posen and George Friedman have highlighted. It leads to the inevitable problem of, one, undermining its own security position, which to Posen, he defines the security position as your ability to project force and to defend state sovereignty, which the United States well has within its defense budget and production. And then secondly, is that all that this does is pursue a position that will only allow more pushback from neighboring states and countries that will inevitably become future parties in the or future anti-American blocs and parties in the future. But with that being said, let's see. Flack makes a comment. He says, I don't know how much Mahanian thinking matters into practice in 2021. Your two targets are landlocked insurgents or nuclear powers. And Flack, do not worry. We'll be actually talking about both insurgency and nuclear diplomacy and deterrence in this book. Those are two things that he addresses as practical considerations in a way to critique his own theory.
Sure, I'll just simply add something onto his little question here about that. So if you're dealing with insurgents, you really don't need a sizable conventional army to deal with those. In my opinion, you really just need just really awesome special forces, basically, and of course, things like the 101st Airborne and the Marine Corps, basically, to deal with that kind of threat. You really don't need a sizable conventional army with, any sort of, tanks and things like that to deal with that. With a surgical pin strike.
Yeah, that's a good way to start outlining some of the issues that are also presented in the book. Along with the hegemony aspect, there's the critique about insurgency, because the traditional American response to insurgency, as we've seen both in Afghanistan and Iraq, and by some extension also our presence within sub-Saharan Africa as well, has been enabling, and redoubling these problems of insurgency by pretty much creating a feedback loop of retaliation, attack, and in doing so, you're furthering the recruitment of these parties. Um, One of the things that Posen makes recognition of is that the difference between, say, an insurgency in Iraq versus, say, an insurgency elsewhere, they may have state sponsorship, is that it then becomes more of a political problem than it does anything else, is because the United States' intervention is only enabling a further anti-American sentiment. You are um, intervening on one half of a nation's political system or an ethnic group, and in doing so, you are shooting yourself in the foot in the ability to defeat the insurgency, because you are inevitably pushing others to that disaffected party you're fighting.
Yeah, correct. He's got some very interesting things to say about the insurgency and how the liberal hegemony doesn't really understand uh, nationalism and that sort of in-group feeling that a lot of other cultures have a stronger sense of, and how that actually could play out in really undermining um, your little project here to socially engineer people across the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that he talks about, especially both inside of the book, but as well as outside of sort of the international school of thought when it comes to foreign policy, is that unlike, say, liberal idealists or those who are a part of the liberal project, that within the realist school of thought is that identity politics, as much as the 2014 YouTube sphere would start sort of rattling on about identity politics, they play a major role in foreign policy, especially when foreign intervention as well. And in doing so, these things are going to play a major role in the ability of how you engage with other countries. And what's one of the biggest things that he argues for in this idea of American restraint in foreign policy, especially within its grand strategy, because the likelihood that you are to engage in the domestic politics of another nation, or like we would argue about intervention in the economy of picking winners and losers, you are doing the same thing in your own foreign policy. The idea that you can socially engineer a democratic state has been proven at this point empirically impossible. We could not, you can fight the insurgency in Iraq to a stalemate, but you cannot make democracy effectively function in a country that has never really had it before, nor has it, been exposed really to any form of liberal institutions outside of its culture. And because of that, we're seeing it now either within the failure of the Afghan government. We can see it in the American attempts and the Western attempts to root and prop up democracies within the Arab Spring, to a point where now the only successful democracy of any sort of pro-Western aid or intervention from the Arab Spring or any part of a military involvement has been Tunisia. And even then, that country is on the brink of democratic collapse as we speak, with its parties trying to maintain kind of functions of government. And all of that. And in doing so, all that you're doing is creating a high, anti-American animosity, and you are innately limiting the ability for the United States to effectively accomplish any task that it needs to from a pure military perspective. And this is where he starts critiquing the liberal part of liberal hegemony, is that this attempt to socially engineer, this attempt to recreate images in your own countries, really does remind me from the argument that Rand Paul had made back around the same time frame, which was, you cannot turn the average Iraqi into someone like Thomas Jefferson overnight, nor would you really want to in this expectation either. And that is where he starts really outlining some of the faults in the Middle East. But in this critique as well, he starts bringing up various other countries from America's involvement, whether it's the incorporating of Eastern European states into NATO, our intervention into, the issue with Bosnia and Serbia in the 1990s. There is a laundry list in which he puts out in the first chapter of the book that really illustrates how much this project has failed, yet it continuously, time and time again, gets re-upped, because in doing so, all that you're doing is allowing foreign countries that aren't getting, paying their fair share, so to speak, to echo Trump and to echo Posen, to, get the American attention, tell them to put more forces here, tell them to spend more money on defense, and in doing so, get involved in these projects that the United States really has no business to. And all at the same time, you're getting these countries to get, call for the same thing again when things aren't going their way. So it's this feedback loop of, power, spending, defense, lobbying that inevitably creates the world to be a more chaotic and hectic place. And I think that is really the best way to describe the first chapter, is just a very detailed account of the history of where this policy comes from, and how the neoconservatives in the post Cold War American political environment really win over the sort of Pat Buchanan, old-fashioned hard right types, as Murray Rothbard would call them. And that's where we're at. And it's a very good point to really, I think, conclude on the conversation there, at least for an outline of the first chapter of the book. Mandrill, is there anything that you wanted to add?
Yes, I just had a couple of different highlights here that I wanted to read out from the first chapter, if you don't mind. Let's see. The first one on the Iraq thing, I just have a little quote here that says, "It is striking that having waged a vicious civil war, Iraqis did not during the U.S. occupation, nor do they now feel any pressure to settle matters that they could lead, indeed may already have led to a resurgence of fighting." And of course, that was pre-ISIS. I thought that was very interesting. Next one, too, is it holds that a group united by language, history, and culture should be protected by the power of a state that it controls. And then the last one I just wanted to share from chapter 1 is, the state owes its people a certain amount of protection from the vicissitudes of modern life. The state is also expected to provide protection from threats that originate outside the society. So you can kind of see his realist worldview at home here. So if you want to move on to the next chapter, we can do that if you'd like, Prudentialist.
I think that a really good way to finish off would be this discussion on the argument that liberals make that this intervention is actually worthwhile. And I think that this is a really good way to just sound off here. So he says, quote, "Proponents of liberal hegemony often elide the difference between those benefits of the strategy that flow to others and those that flow to the United States. Individually, it is surely true that cheap riders and reckless drivers, like the current situation, because of the welfare and security or power gains that accrue to them. United States commitments may make the international politics of some regions less exciting than others would be in the case. The United States, however, pays a significant price and assumes significant risks to provide these benefits to others, while the gains to the United States are greatly exaggerated because the United States is inherently quite secure in its security position." And this is, I think, a really good way to outline just the problems that he's making within the book. And in the second chapter is this discussion, of course, about the, those are the perils of the liberal hegemony. And thus he starts making what he calls in the second chapter is the case for restraint, which sort of breaks down around the problems of what are the geopolitical interests of the United States, along with the issue of nuclear deterrence and nuclear security, the struggle of insurgency, which we briefly touched on, and then, of course, the problems of numerous regions and, of course, areas that are already integrated, like Europe. And I know that someone had mentioned earlier in chat was the conversation about nuclear deterrence. And this is one part, of course, that Posen makes as one of the most important aspects for the United States to still maintain an international presence abroad, is that whether it is the Non-Proliferation Treaty or the Test Ban Treaty, these, international agreements should be of the utmost importance of the nuclear-armed world to continue and to maintain. He highlights that his several concerns, of course, are not necessarily state actors pursuing a nuclear weapon, as state actors are going to try and pursue nuclear weapons as a way to have legitimacy recognized abroad. This is why you're going to constantly see nations like North Korea and Iran pursue a nuclear weapons program, and in doing so to maintain some sort of legitimacy from outside nuclear-armed state actors. And those are areas in which he believes are important in the argument for American presence. Nuclear deterrence is always going to be an issue. And this is why a diplomatic presence rather than an ongoing military, either poking the bear or poking the dragon, so to speak, as he refers to the Chinese question, those need to be considered in a way to mitigate the likelihood of nuclear proliferation. On the other hand, he also talks about with nuclear weapons is that in doing so, traditional state ground forces are not going to be as necessary if you're going to engage in a state-on-state war with, traditional nuclear armed actors. Because at the end, you can only go so far with a nuclear armed state in terms of actual, uniparty state actors and state actors getting popular. And in doing so, the traditional military presence are going to be required, a stronger focus, thus restraint on the political solutions will be necessary, because at the end, when you're looking at the cost efficiency puzzle of war, there's no way that you can find any sort of mutual gain or beneficiary state from the use or proliferation of nuclear weapons. And that's one of the first things that he talks about in regards to America's geopolitical interest, which is the proliferation of nuclear weapons and trying to prevent, NPT violations and ensuring that, we try our best to mitigate non-state actors from getting a hold of them.
Yes, I just have one little slight quibble on your last very lengthy point here, Prudentialist. So for anybody who's not aware, when Barry Posen he uses the term free riders and what was the other one? Cheapskates, something like that.
And reckless drivers.
Anyway, yeah, reckless drivers and cheap riders, right? And what he means by that is essentially a cheap rider is somebody like Sweden or a Germany who is going to not pay their agreed fair share in accordance with Section 5 for their national defense budget. And they're basically going to use the umbrella of American military power and basically outsource that to the United States, essentially. Whereas a reckless driver is somebody who looks a little bit more like Israel and just understands that, oh, well, America is going to have our back no matter what, so we can just do whatever we like. And that's pretty much what that looks like.
Yeah, and the other thing that he talks about, along with this focus on internationalism with regards to nuclear, non-proliferation, is the recognition that despite the idealistic political push for total nuclear disarmament, it's not going to happen, most likely. We're not going to see a world where everyone pulls a South Africa or Australia and disarm themselves from nuclear weapons, or engage in a policy where they are adverse to anything regarding nuclear energy or even things like depleted uranium. And he recognizes that nuclear armed states also serve as an effective deterrence from all-out war and all-out conflict, especially when it comes to highly populated areas. He criticizes, he does offer some critiques of Israel, but he cites Israel as the fact that Israel is a nuclear armed state, despite their denials, and it does so to allow them to act as a way to fight off any likelihood of state actor on state actor war against more populous Arab nations and coalitions. And in the same way that Pakistan is armed with nuclear weapons to hold off against a more populous India, and India has nuclear weapons to hold off against a populous China, and so on. While these, nuclear armed states are most likely not going to engage for those reasons, nuclear armed states also have the opportunity to provide leadership regionally when it comes to diplomatic and security issues, as well as other common areas of political, economic, and strategic interest, even for states that have nuclear armaments that may be, pointed against themselves or pointed against the bordering states against them. And in doing so, it gives them the necessary political and security clout in order to engage on these issues. And he mentions this later on in the book when he starts talking about European defense autonomy. Even though this is pre-Brexit, mind you, he argues that, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, as well as others in the area that are armed with nuclear weapons, have the capability to, collectively, push for, European defense autonomy and allow them to actually spend the necessary, 2.5% GDP on defense with a slow phase out of American presence. But it's important, though, that these are just 3 or 4 points that he lists out in the first part, that nuclear deterrence and nuclear proliferation are one of the few areas in which a widespread American presence might be required. Any thoughts there, Mandrill?
No, not on that one. I would. Yeah, I think that point's pretty self-explanatory.
There is one part, though, that he talks about when it comes to nuclear armed states or states that are pursuing nuclear weapons that I think is interesting. If you get a copy with the book of the version that I have on screen, which is the paperback edition, it is on page 77, where he starts talking about Iran's pursuits of nuclear weapons. So this is 1 year before the JCPOA, before the world started knowing about what's known as the P5+1 agreement, or the Iran nuclear deal. And he says, quote, the evidence that Iran is governed by religious fanatics bent on martyrdom does not stand up well to close scrutiny. Iran indeed does have a system of government that is difficult to comprehend, and religion plays a huge role in its politics. Some analysts have built these facts in an argument that Iran cannot be deterred. Though widely parroted, this argument is not well supported. It depends upon dubious interpretations of religious beliefs and selective use of important facts. Yes, partly on the basis of these arguments, not only Israel, but the United States has contemplated a preventative war. A careful examination of these arguments by scholar Andrew Grotto reveals that few sources are actually cited to support them, and that they are cited over and over, and charitably, and are misinterpreted often. Iran's religious leaders have shown themselves in the past to be sensitive to the costs. The founder of Iran's revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, ceased the war with Iraq in the 1980s when he determined the casualties and economic damage were too great, and risked the survival of the Islamic Republic. And the supreme leader Ayatollah Khomeini has issued a fatwa revealed in August 2005 against the development, production, and stockpiling and use of nuclear weapons, although the purpose of this fatwa is opaque. The fatwa suggests, at a minimum, some are aware that nuclear weapons are particularly destructive and terrible for the state security of Iran. End quote. And the reason why I thought that this was just an interesting position was that... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say on that point, I mean, yes, that's another one of those little realist observations, right, is that a regime is usually going to, the ideology, once it's in power, comes secondary to maintaining its power. So, I mean, you can really see what the same flavor of stuff here when he's talking about Iran.
And keep in mind, right, like when we analyze nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, one of the things that I think also gets brought up when we talk about free riders or reckless drivers, and he mentions this with Israel as well when it comes to Iran in the book, but also in his talks about here, is that in 2007, 2008, Bashar al-Assad is beginning to provide a nuclear enrichment program for the development of nuclear weapons. And in doing so, what does Israel do? Israel crosses Turkish airspace and bombs the living hell out of Syria in order to ensure that those nuclear enrichment sites are destroyed and that necessary materials are secured, and that, al-Assad's attempts and ambitions to create nuclear weapons are retarded back several years. Now, keep in mind, throughout the last 30 or so years, there has been numerous talks from Israeli intelligence as well as American intelligence about the idea that Iran is months or a couple of weeks or a couple of years away under Iran's regime about nuclear weapons. And if so really were the case, if it is a nuclear armed state, then A, we already acknowledge that they have nuclear weapons. That's why Israel's not doing anything about it. But B, it's seemingly a way to goad the United States into more positions into the Middle East, which is argued extensively in another book that we're going to be covering in the near future, also by John Mearsheimer, called The Israeli Lobby. So we'll dive into that sometime in the future, but it's something I just thought that was interesting to point out when it comes to nuclear proliferation, Iran, in the Middle East.
Sorry there, Credentialist, you kind of cut out in the middle of that.
Oh, well, just that we'll be touching base on the Israel-Iran nuclear factor in the future here on the channel when it comes to the nuclear weapons question, as well as Israeli intelligence and the pushing from said country about intervening with a preventive war in relation to the quote by Posen that I read earlier.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
And that really just covers the section here in regards to American involvement in regards to nuclear proliferation and treatment. The rest of this chapter about the case for restraint is illustrating the military power and the regional leadership is going to be capable of well-intended ways to lead to more defense autonomy within the region, especially in regards to Europe and NATO. European defense autonomy, and then also questioning the structures within the Asiatic region. I figured that we'd start with European defense autonomy first, Mandrill, because I feel like this is the easy one to cover, because the China-Asia question is far more tricky, especially when this was written, because not much has particularly changed in the argument in regards to the European defense autonomy. The biggest difference from, say, myself arguing for European defense autonomy and Posen arguing for European defense autonomy is that Posen argues that the best institutional structure to lead that would be that of the European Union, whereas I, for one, hold the position, similar to Friedman and other scholars, that the European Union is not an effective institution. We have criticized its neo-functionalist structure and theoretical roots on this channel, and we know that it is not bound to last very long, or at least in its current state. That, and I also hold the very biased Peter Hitchens view that the European Union is organized Germanism by other means. So it would be very difficult to ensure European defense autonomy against a widely unpopular institution that has been gaining unpopularity from 2008 onwards to 2014 when this book was written. Just 2 years later, the Eurosceptic movement gets a win in the United Kingdom in terms of Brexit. If you're going to pursue European defense autonomy, Posen suggests a slow phasing out of NATO and sort of transferring the reins of institutional and strategic power over to the European Union, which of course we could debate that on end. I do not think that this trusting of institutions like the EU would be an effective way, because I think with hindsight in mind, we can definitely see the push for a European military or a European defense strategy independent of the United States has been primarily back and forth between two countries, the most powerful countries militarily in Western Europe, that of France and Germany, which brings into careful questions about how well a EDA policy would work out if it were phased over to the European Union. I'm sure you've got lots of thoughts on that, Mandrill.
Actually, I do have a lot of thoughts on the European question, but the first one I wanted to address here with Posen was also another idea here that he talks about is the Russia situation, and he's saying that, well, okay, Russia's not a superpower anymore. However, it's rebounded from its post-Soviet doldrums. It isn't a global superpower, but he thinks that it has enough economic and military might to be able to be a player in a balance of power politics, right? Posen talks a lot about, okay, if you have one power and then another power, you oftentimes don't need another power which is like another top tier. You just need one that's going to be able to shift the balance and let the other two play off of each other, right? So that was an idea that is also very present in Posen's work here.
Yeah, and I think that also shows a lot of the Kenneth Waltz influence on his scholarship. Keep in mind that Kenneth Waltz had always argued for bipolarity, or more or less the idea that the world order is going to be a lot better, not under a unipolar world framework, but rather an effective defensive balance of power between two, regions, nations, or world powers. Now, he's arguing it at the time, right? This argument comes out in the 1980s, the height of the Cold War. But I think that this argument can be easily translated. And I think we can see its, progeny show itself in this book, especially when he's arguing for European defense autonomy about Russian and sort of that Western European defense bloc, where Russia's not a superpower like Mandrill says, but at the same time it's also bounced back. So it would be better for those two to work themselves together and allow that to have a more regional, closer communication and find some sort of balance of power. Anything you wanted to add there, Mandrill? Or do you want to move on?
Oh, sorry. So one of the things I had to add on Russia's on the feasibility of cooperation with Russia militarily is you have to remember that all of the, or at least a lot of the gear that they have, especially with their navy, is all fairly old. Like we talk about the aging fleet of the United States with, the earliest Arleigh Burke class destroyers being built in the 1990s, and the Ticonderoga class cruisers, which you see very prominently on the front cover here of Restraint. Those ships are all 30 years old. They're all approaching the end of their service lives. And but Russia's in even worse state here. Like all the classes and individual ships that they have, you'd find that a lot of them are even older than the Tycho cruisers that we have in our surface fleet. So from that perspective, Russia does have a capable fleet. They do get underway quite a bit, but you have to remember that these issues with like maintenance and long-term sustainability in the actual field is going to be likely an issue for them for those older platforms.
Actually, that really reminded me of a point earlier about that Posen makes in regards to nuclear weapons, because Posen argues in this sort of confident and argumentative fashion, or at least in a very declaratory way, that America's got a sizable nuclear weapons program. It's maintained, it's taken care of, it would manage itself not only for first strike but also retaliatory capability. And it made me think of the ongoing problem is that the United States, in the similar way that Russia's got an aging navy, the United States has a very aging form of what's known as the nuclear triad. So that regards to missiles, aircraft, and submarine deployment of nuclear weapons. The most updated one in terms of management is going to be its submarines. You're still using a majority of B-52 class weapons in regards to nuclear weapon, at least from high altitudes. It's B-2 bomber craft are still being tested, but they're also aging quite well. I just thought that this was something that I think that Posen could have spent more time on, because the American military triad of nuclear deterrence is aging and does need significant upkeep and reinvestment. But that was just a thought that came to mind when it came to this conversation about aging weapons and equipment. The most recent and modern investment that Russia has put in, though, into its navy is that of its icebreaker fleet and creating nuclear-powered icebreakers. And I believe the Sunday stream number 14 talks about that ongoing arms race of sorts in the Arctic Circle.
Also, they have recently, within at least since I was in active service, when Barry Posen wrote this in 2014, the Russians actually did manage to make a new class of actually nuclear-powered, nuclear-capable submarines for their fleet. So they have actually re-upped their submarine fleet to be modernized, which they're actually regarded as being very, very good by the U.S. military. So I would say, just real quick on Tom Nguyen's point here, Russian ships are apparently more heavily armed than us. Well, yes, Tom, it does. It's yes and no. It depends on doctrinally what you're talking about here. The U.S. fleet is able to, and is really structurally focused on its carriers. We like our carriers a lot. So offensively, if you're looking at, say, a Tycho class cruiser or a destroyer, they're really not going to shine in a surface engagement like the Russian ships are, just because of the missiles that are involved. Because Harpoon, if you remember correctly, is about a 30 to 40-year-old weapons platform. So yeah, that's pretty much all I got to say on that. It's just a matter of, okay, Russia's just old stuff is older. It's all Cold War era, although they do have some newer stuff. But the United States just has a totally different doctrine, which revolves around its carrier fleet. So,
which brings us to the two other areas that he really argues for in the case for restraint, which is the position of what to do in Asia, and then the question of what should be the post-American involvement in the Middle East, which, of course, at the time, right, he's arguing for the security of the control of oil production. He argues that it is interest in the interest of the Middle East, but also in the interest of the United States and those sort of dependent upon oil and the petrodollar, that not one singular state controls oil production. And on top of that, he's arguing that...
Yeah, I actually have...
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, if I might cut in here for 1 sec. He also talks about oil production in the Middle East, and I just had a little footnote here, which is essentially stating that the United States, if it's energy independent, if it's an energy exporter, is not really going to be required to get itself involved in the Middle East. These are things that you can start thinking about, right? So that if it's not required to go into the Middle East to secure its oil position, well, okay, friendship with Israel is not exactly going to be as attractive. There's just really not going to be any secondary reason of, say, intelligence gathering or intelligence data sharing or cooperation to secure the oil, in the Middle East, if that, energy independence is maintained by the United States.
And that also kind of allows us to look back with some hindsight, right? Is that there appeared to be that under the Trump administration, where America was starting in 2014, you had the shale oil boom and revolution that was happening here in the U.S. America was becoming a predominant oil exporter, or at least a natural gas one as well. We were producing our own energy. We were energy independent for the first time. And that the United States seemed to be rather postured in a way to start pulling back from the Middle Eastern region. The Trump administration was articulating about withdrawal from Afghanistan, at the same time trying to secure peace agreements between various Arab nations and the Israeli government, stuff that hadn't been seen in really since 1967 after its conflicts, which would allow for, a diplomatic bloc as well as a potentially strategic one to operate as sort of this regional counterbalance towards Iran. To which now we're seeing more, American discussion about what to deal with in Iran. The Biden administration is trying to essentially use force to get Iran back to the Iran nuclear deal after the Trump administration's abandonment of it. Anything that you wanted to add on the Iran or Israel question with the petrodollar?
No, not really. That's pretty much all I'm willing to say on YouTube.
Fair point. Which I guess brings us to the most interesting section at all in his case for restraint, is the current situation in China, which is why we spent like a good 15 minutes to the beginning here to talk about the context of when this was written in the context of the pivot to Asia and written in 2014. which for all intents and purposes makes this a relatively contemporary work. But at the same time, we've got 7 years of hindsight to look at us, which of course it's important in regards to how we should look at China. One of the things that in Restraint that Posen argues for is more of a military defense autonomy with its partners. In his talks and in his book, in regards to Restraint, Posen is arguing for a reduced ground presence in places like South Korea and in Japan, at least with ground troops. Like we have a Marine deployment, of course, on Okinawa. And he argues that, these things are there for the sole purpose of a strategic tripwire, that if anything were to go hot, you are likely to just bring in the United States automatically because American troops are there and most likely are going to be attacked. Mandrill, I saw that you wanted to cut in there.
Oh, no, I mean, it's just yeah. No, I don't really have anything else to add on that.
Okay, well, I mean, the other thing that he talks about, of course, is the question about our positioning on China. His biggest critique, arguing at this time towards the pivot to China, is that the United States is engaging in a very similar Cold War structure about containment, which, of course, if we have history as our guide, right, it's not like the containment policy necessarily worked effectively. To some extent, it did. But it did cost the United States a significant amount of blood and treasure to enforce. And he is arguing that unlike the Soviet Union, which at no point in time throughout the Cold War did the Soviet Union match the United States in terms of purchasing power parity, the triple P, or its gross domestic product. The United States more or less held throughout the Cold War a 2-to-1 advantage on those two key economic factors. China, however, on the other side of the coin, doesn't meet that.
Yeah, sorry if I may cut in here on this issue. Yeah, that's pretty significant, right? When you talk about the economic difference between us and the Soviet Union, and then, I mean, I know there's a lot of talk about how China's a paper tiger, but there's still a significant industrial manufacturing capability. I know a lot of people poo-poo that as well, but yeah, China does have the factories. They do have the shipbuilding capabilities. They have a lot of stuff. And they are not a threat to be underestimated in that regard. But, I know Barry Posen basically doesn't think that China is as great of a threat as it could be. But that's a very important idea, Prudentialist, about how the United States, if it really wants to start engaging with China and start to try to contain it, it is going to need real allies and not allies that we are essentially paying for. There's an interesting idea, just to tie this back with some other thinkers, right? I know there's some other people in the foreign policy sphere that essentially call that system of Cold War cooperation. They basically call it a bribe, essentially, which, I mean, if you don't really have the money to give out anymore, or the military power to back it up, if people don't want to cooperate with you as much as you used to, being a hegemon, post World War II. So it's a very different world, and things are just going to have to change in that regard. And he's absolutely right. So.
Yep, I wholeheartedly would agree with that point there, is that his argument for containment is only going to exacerbate the security pushback. And as Steve points out in the chat, and this is something that Posen talks about as well with those economic factors, is that unlike the Soviet bloc and its sort of economic engagement with only explicitly communist countries for ideological reasons, as well as for its own, strategic limitations due to American sanctions and American presence of force, is that China is far more integrated into the global economy, and Posen makes this very clear. China has ambition to be engaged in there, not just as a regional hegemonic power, but as a global partner in economic trade. All it takes is to look at that GIF from like 1988 to 2018 about the world #1 trading partner preference between the United States and China taking up most of the map. And as Tom Nguyen points out in chat, U.S. companies didn't build a factory in the USSR during the Cold War now, but we have factories in China now. So, and that's a very good point, and something that Posen articulates that it puts the United States in a very strategically paradoxical position, because you want to contain something that you are also economically dependent on, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. Diplomatically, it doesn't make a lot of sense because you are posturing yourself with someone that has strategic control over, rare earth, minerals and things that are needed for our own version of defense. They have a sizable market share of that particular market, which is needed for military infrastructure. Not to mention they manufacture a lot of our shit, and we're dependent upon that. And it's also a partial reason why, with ongoing trade disputes, we're seeing some issues in regards to global supply chain issues on top of increased demand due to everything that's happened in the last year and a half, which is one of the most valid critiques he brings in here. But if Mandrill won't mind, I also think that it's quite timely that I read this section in regards to China and Taiwan, in part because we're seeing a lot of this.
Yes. Yeah, you saw that section too, right? I flipped to that section last night when I was reading my book as well. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to read this quote here for everyone in the audience and those who are going to be watching this later in regards to China and Taiwan. So, quote, the structure of U.S. commitment to Taiwan is uniquely dangerous. China is a nuclear power. Though its forces are limited, some can reach U.S. soil. Thus, U.S. commitment implies a risk of nuclear escalation. Despite the evidence that China does not have an itchy nuclear trigger finger, we should understand that confrontation could turn into one of relative will. The U.S. commitment to risk nuclear war over Taiwan is inherently not credible. First, China believes Taiwan to be a lost province. Taiwan's independence is recognized by fewer and fewer nations, so it is viewed as internationally legitimate. Second, though indirectly, the United States has conceded Taiwan to be a lost province. And third, the United States can convey no strong strategic interest to China because there are no strong interests. And fourth, the United States has eschewed many years...
Prudential, you're starting to cut out.
I have to love
Prudential, you're cutting out there. We're missing.
Well, I appreciate it because I'm
yeah, sorry.
Rural internet is a bitch.
Yeah, I don't want you. Yeah, I don't want you to robot hear it. Give people half of what you're trying to say.
Well, I will try. How about now?
Sounds good now.
Okay, everyone in chat saying I'm not cutting out, so maybe it could be just the connection there.
Oh well.
Okay, cool.
It might just be me. That might be it.
Yeah, it happens with a poor connection because it can happen with me sometimes when the internet's low. But I'm gonna restart the quote here, and then we'll continue. So yeah, I'll let me start over. Just start over again, just in case I did cut out or anything like that. He says, the structure of U.S. commitment to Taiwan is uniquely dangerous. However, the United States' engagement might risk a nuclear conflict. And then I will get to the third and fourth points here that I think are really important. Third, there are no strong interests because the United States can no longer convey a strategic interest to China. And fourth, the United States has eschewed many years ago that the principal physical move that one can employ to convey interests, the basing of U.S. forces. For now, China would expect the United States to fight for Taiwan, and the non-nuclear balance of forces will still favor the United States. This probably induces caution. And this is an important point to make because what we're talking about in regards to our current situation with Taiwan, especially more recently, is there the sharing of polls about how there's this plurality of Americans that wish to defend Taiwan. There is no strategic interest for the United States to do so other than for political reasons. In the past, we've talked about on this channel that even as far back as Chinese rapprochement under Nixon and Kissinger, that even Kissinger's conversations with Premier Chou Enlai was that the United States recognizes the territorial claims that China has over Taiwan. And they understand that this territorial claim, but they are limited by its political posturing of anti-communism in both the Democratic and Republican parties at the time, something to which the United States to this day still pushes under the name of human rights, democracy, and human decency, which of course is something that Barry Posen in this book recognizes as a strategic concern. pushing for containment is only going to escalate the situation. You are going to engage in the security dilemma of both nations escalating their military investment in the area. We've seen that China has announced a development of its new navy to outnumber the American fleet by 2026. And the United States is trying to reassure its allies, India, Australia, South Korea, and Japan, that the United States is here to stay. This policy of containment, as Posen outlines, is not only dangerous for the nuclear risk, but you are only making the likelihood for war over an island that the United States is technically recognized to be a lost Chinese province all the more likely. And I'm sure that there's plenty to talk about there, Mandrill, if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I do actually. I also just wanted to also continue on a little bit on the weapons discussion from earlier. I just wanted everybody to understand that China has, in addition to building its own homebrew fleet, has access to the purchasing of old Soviet weapons tech, right? So Kilo-class submarines, Sovereignty destroyers, pretty much everything that the Soviets had access to, the Chinese have access to as well. So it makes them very, in terms of like how the access of the diversity of weapons that they can use. I mean, it's very difficult since they have everything essentially, and then they have their own stuff on top of that. So it's very fascinating on that point from the perspective of a sea battle in the South China Sea.
Yeah, I would agree there wholeheartedly. The other issue to address, of course, is the aspect of American manufacturing in there. And like I said, this is 2014. This is when foreign policy wonks start taking a look inward. And Dave makes a point about the U.S. need to decouple from Chinese manufacturing. That's one of the big points that Richard Haas talks about getting its fiscal house in order and state security is the United States trying to decouple and reshore its own manufacturing base. But by identifying these problems, Barry Posen's idea of restraint is in really two key factors. The idea of having nations that we considered allies for a long time, these sort of free riders, focus on defense autonomy, at least those that are capable, which would allow you to have quote unquote real allies. And then secondly, a restructuring of the military based upon what he thinks are strategic importance, which is going to be intelligence gathering and primarily a naval presence, what he calls the command of the commons. So this argument about a common defense strategy for the security of American sovereignty, while supporting what he calls real allies as a more cost-effective measure. And one of the fun sections in this third chapter is the discussion over space. And there are a few points here that I wanted to read out for you guys that I thought that you would enjoy. Because he says the United States spends a vast amount on reconnaissance, navigation, and communication satellites, which provide a standing infrastructure to conduct military operations around the globe. And later on, he writes about he says the Obama administration approaches space with equal energy, but is somewhat with less bold rhetoric. To where he argues for the United States will need to pursue a set of interrelated strategic approaches to meet our national security space objectives. And he provides 5 points. 1, promote responsible, peaceful, and safe use of space. 2, provide improved U.S. space capability. 3, partner with responsible nations, international organizations, and commercial firms. 4, prevent and deter aggression against space infrastructure that supports U.S. national security. And 5, prepared to defeat attacks that operate in a degraded environment. And those are the 5 points that he makes in regards to space. All before there's this conversation about a U.S. Space Force. Keep in mind that we do have space capabilities. We do have significant investment in research and development via Raytheon and other companies to provide deterrence to satellite kill weaponry that India, China, and the Russians have. But at the same time, we also have significant reconnaissance capabilities, such as the X-37B that the United States Air Force operates. And now we have this newly formed Space Force, which has both been ridiculed and lauded. But I thought that was one of the most interesting aspects about the command of commons was this idea of shifting more towards a naval presence and shifting more towards a intelligence infrastructure way to support these allies. And I think that's something that's very important in recognizing this case for restraint, that it doesn't necessarily require a physical on-the-ground presence, but more of a information one, and something that needs to be more, brought into focus.
Yeah, and just from the things that we know about fourth and fifth generation warfare, the information and intelligence war is the latest greatest frontier, as well as the electronic warfare and things like that. So I mean, that's just something that, as a capability, the United States military is definitely focusing on in terms of improving its capabilities.
There's a comment in chat regarding to what about the recent resignation of a cybersecurity guy within the Department of Defense, saying that U.S. cybersecurity infrastructure is kindergarten level compared to China, which I think is why Posen is advocating for more investment within those realms. I think that the United States, I would agree with that term at all. I mean, during the Obama administration, you had the Office of Personnel Management leak, hack. We've had numerous cyber attacks from what can only be presumed to be state actors regarding personal information. You've had hacker groups easily take down the sort of, that oil pipeline earlier this year, causing a sharp spike in gas prices here in the United States. So yeah, I would be inclined to agree with him. And I think that even in the book, Posen recognizes that this is an area in which the United States needs to up its defense, because in terms of national security and the defense of national sovereignty, in that one sentence description of his of his grand strategy question of what grand strategy is, the United States is severely lacking in putting its own infrastructure involved to defend things like the power grid, to defend our own information, our communications, our tactics. And that's something that the United States has been severely lacking for a long time. Even during the Cold War, the Soviet Union had information about the ways that we communicate and the ways that we have conversations. So if ever there was a hot war, strategic information the Soviet Union would have easy access to. So I'm not surprised at all that he's comparing us to a kindergarten level next to China. And if you have read Unrestricted Warfare, which I highly recommend all of you do, we'll cover that sometime in the future on this channel on Prudent Reads. That's something that China's been focusing on for a very long time.
Yes, that Unrestricted Warfare book I know is very popular in military circles as well. So if you wanted to pick it up, it definitely has some information in it.
But yeah, so this is his argument about Command of the Commons, which is chapter 3, which I think highlights his strategic way of how to get there. What would the defense budget look like in 2014, money to terms with the defense budget? He makes the argument that the United States could reduce its defense spending by about roughly 25% in 2013, 2014 dollars, simply by, putting it at a firm number of 2.5% of GDP on defense spending. Because if by slowly withdrawing and focusing on real ally defense autonomy and helping support the manufacturing bases of those countries for their own defense needs, the United States can then focus on its own internal security and reinvest said money while also decreasing spending towards things like electronic infrastructure and military intelligence and reconnaissance. And in doing so, he tries to outline what that process would look like, what the budget would look like, and which is something that a lot of foreign policy people don't really do nowadays. And this is something that I have a lot of one of the reasons why I commend this book is because Posen takes the time to highlight what it would actually look like, and most importantly, how do you actually get there? Because something that I've talked about on this channel and something that I plan to write about on Substack, hopefully out this week, will be the discussion that, the world doesn't pause. Whether you want to change the regime or you want to change a specific aspect of foreign policy, you need to highlight how you're going to get there or what it would look like, especially because, we do have this infrastructure that's in place. How can you withdraw that infrastructure? How do you bring it back? How do you spend less? What would it still look like? And I think Posen, at the very least, while he is definitely liberal in terms of how he views things, as we talked about in the past, realism does have a particular reactionary bent to it. And I think that if anyone is to pursue a reactionary foreign policy, this book offers a very interesting way in a very realistic way on how to attain that, whether it's through defense autonomy, restructuring of investment, and focusing more on critical infrastructure and our naval needs to secure economic routes of trade.
Yep, those are all things that we need to do. No disagreements from me there.
Which sort of brings us then to the last chapter of the book, and a really good way to wrap it up, which is the discussion about the ongoing debate about what this foreign policy would look like, but the also ongoing discussion about how much international involvement the United States should be in, and in doing so, is this the critiques of restraint. He is very open to criticisms about it. He is open to the aspect about the chaotic, anarchic nature of the world. Realism, as we talk about on this channel a lot, because I myself am a realist, more of an offensive one than anything else. And so is Mandrill, is a realist as well, that the world is inherently anarchic, chaotic. There's no global sovereign. There's no global leadership. There's more that needs to be done in order to maintain that security. And in the last chapter of the book, he starts highlighting some of the criticisms that he's expected, and also in conversations he's had with fellow foreign policy academics. How likely are these defense autonomies to work out because other nation states would like to pursue power on their own? How much of that world order operates? All of these things are things that he criticizes and takes into consideration as well, whether it's the budget or a focus on the Navy. All of these things, which I think are very important for us to be reflexive in our own ideas. And I'm sure that there's quite a few sections in there that we can hash out, Mandrill, if there's one that you wanted to point out.
Let's see, in his conclusion and critiques, let's see, I have a couple different quotes here, if you'd like. All right, so he says basically, first quote, we may soon confront a new bipolar competition with China, or we may face a new multipolar world in which several nation states or confederations of great capability stand together at the top of the global pecking order, each warily eyeing the other and simultaneously calculating one another's potential utility as allies. I mean, that's just an encapsulation of everything you've just said right there. So let's see. Here's another good one that I liked. The greatest danger to U.S. sovereignty is a hegemon on the Eurasian landmass. The danger is now low, but please be prepared to counter it should it reemerge. If such a challenge does reemerge, however, the United States ought not manage it like it did the Cold War, shouldering the bulk of the burden because the U.S. relative power position is unlikely to be as favorable. I mean, we've already gone over that. The United States will need to give up some objectives. The coercive reform and political reorganization of other countries has proven expensive, and success has proven elusive. And let's see. That's pretty much the encapsulation of his entire conclusion there. Is there any other quotes that you had in the conclusion here, Prudentialist?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to bring up the divide about realists, because again, Barry Posen is highly influenced by Kenneth Waltz, who is arguably one of the most influential scholars of the 20th century in regards to realism, next to Morgenthau and Mearsheimer. And there are other, and Robert Gilpin as well. But one of the things that he talks about is how realists don't agree on anything. There are numerous schools of realism. And I wanted to bring up offensive realism because I kind of lean towards this position. And he says, quote, an alternative critique could be leveled by offensive realists. They believe international politics is highly competitive. If China continues to grow, they could see a serious challenge, but as all but inevitable. For some, remedy is to contain China now. The United States should begin to organize a defensive coalition, even if some local actors are not quite ready for it. Though left unstated, confronting China now could provide an opportunity for preventative action, to stall China's growth or involve it in a limited but losing war, which might humiliate and collapse the regime. I doubt that the gains of such a preventative action should outweigh the costs and risks. More traditional preventative war is seldom discussed, and probably due to high nuclear risks that such a war would incur, end quote. Which I think is really timely when we talked about last week the bargaining model of war, especially when we talk about, is war going to be something that has its payoff greater than the costs associated with said conflict? And this is where one area in regards to China that I do not think that the cost of war, when it outweighs the payoffs, especially when we look at its current capacity building, the fact it is a nuclear armed state. It's a lot of issues that I think would be better to reach some kind of settlement or some kind of agreement between the two diplomatically, rather than engaging there. Which, again, when it comes to the Taiwan issue, right, Posen and I are very much in agreement, where there is, Taiwan is not in the strategic interests of the United States. And even I read earlier today that Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing is moving out of Taiwan and it is moving to Japan. So a lot of access to important technologies that the United States, leans and depends on, and that the Japanese depend on, is moving towards Japan. So there's less of a reason now to implicate, a call for defense with Taiwan. And I think that is something is vital to point out. One, especially because realists are not going to agree on anything. And this is one section where I do not think that an all-out containment style war with the Chinese is not going to work. I don't like the Chinese, but at the same time, I don't like our own, leadership here at home. But both of them are a problem that do need to be addressed. I just don't think that having our current regime go all out in war would be the appropriate way to do it. And so I highly recommend this book. If you can't tell already, Mandrill and I both. Mandrill recommended it to me. I've read it twice. I really do agree with a lot of its framework. And I really appreciate that he goes out in the 4th chapter to acknowledge a lot of these critiques that would most likely be leveled, and some critiques he's came across himself when writing this book and drafting it out throughout 2013 and publishing it in 2014. So it does get a glowing review from me, at least. But was there anything in chapter 4 that you wanted to round up there on before we take any questions?
Yes, actually, I do have a couple more quotes at the end here, just to give a real awesome conclusion here before we take questions. Realists like to quote the 19th century German statesman Otto von Bismarck, who said, "Preventive war is like committing suicide for fear of death." Preventive Cold War also has that quality. So you can see the defensive realism inherent to Posen's worldview here. And then lastly, the very second to last paragraph, when he's talking about failure. Failure to admit what we are doing will ensure that U.S. resources will not be focused on the main capabilities that support the most crucial interests of the United States, but will be spread like peanut butter. Ambiguity may permit the advocates of liberal hegemony to promote policies that involve the United States in more half-baked and costly misadventures. The major obstacles to liberal hegemony that I have advanced in this book will likely prove enduring, and indeed will probably intensify. And obviously, I put a little footnote here about the naval capability discussions in the comprehensive review document. So if you ever are an autist or a nerd, you want to see what the U.S. Navy really looks like, I'd highly recommend you look up comprehensive review. And that's it. That's all I have to say on the rest of the book, because that's the conclusion.
Yeah. If you want to know where a lot of Barry gets his ideas of what this world might look like, because this was written in 2014, he is looking at the National Security Council's Global Trends analysis, where they are predictively forecasting what the world would look like in 10 to 20 years. So the first one that he looked at was the 2005 National Security Council, which was the Global Trends Prediction 2025. And then the most recent one being the Global Trends Council's presentation of what the world will look like in global trends for 2030. So if you want to get an idea of where he's coming from based on this prediction about how the unipolar movement is going to die out as more powers gain, economic and strategic hegemony, at least in that sphere of influence, that's what he does. Which I think allows us to bring a really just, a final thoughts on the book. I greatly enjoyed this book. Like I mentioned earlier, it earns my glowing recommendation. And then there's a lot that we can tell from the last 7 years that have rang incredibly true. We're seeing discussions over European defense autonomy. We saw Trump push for our freeloading allies to pay their fair share. And in fact, earlier last month in September of this year, Barry Posen wrote an article about the Transatlantic Alliance, arguing for European defense autonomy in order to ensure that it's cost effective. It allows the United States to prioritize its interests elsewhere, and in doing so, allows the U.S. to come back in and focus on the things that it needs, more so domestically, especially as we begin to pull out from the Middle East and the European Union and parties involved that are more militarily armed, specifically France, can have more of an interest in their own affairs. So I know that you just popped out for a second there, Mandrill. I was just arguing for reasons about why this book is recommended and how, Posen wrote just last month about the Transatlantic Alliance.
Yes. Yeah, so very, very timely stuff from him there. Have anything specific to say there about the new stuff that's going on with the Biden administration in regards to the recent weapons sale to Australia?
I've been following it for a while. When the deal was announced, I kind of got furious, Pertinax, and I got Semiagog on for a stream. We sort of discussed military capability, what this means, and strategic reprioritization. However, is the deal kind of becomes more publicly available in what it wants to do about having subs and technology out by the 30s and 40s. This deal may be abandoned in terms of its timeline for that purpose. Edward Luttwak, who is well known for writing about geoeconomics, grand strategy, and geopolitics, it's in regards to defense, who has also written a scathing indictment against people like Donald Rumsfeld. There's a lot there, I think, that shows that this AUKUS agreement, it may be for more of a posturing. However, the United States has sort of made itself very clear on the Taiwanese issue. There are people who work in private sectors in the West who have worked in China. Balding's World being one of them. You can follow him on Twitter at Balding's World. I highly recommend him for good takes on China because he lived and worked there for several years. Is that the United States essentially had a brush-in with the Chinese, with the submarine sort of getting hit by one. And in doing so, there was a lot of, confrontation politically, which then later, it gets leaked out to the press that, the United States has armed forces inside Taiwan and have had them for a couple of years now. They're training forces for possible counterinsurgency against any sort of land invasion. And that, we have engaged in this agreement and we're now working with the Japanese. And by the way, the new Japanese prime minister is the former minister of defense, who is a protege of Shinzo Abe that wants to amend Article 9 of the Constitution to allow an offensive military. So there is a lot more containment that is being doubled down on, and to which China has been putting itself in a more defensive position because of that. There was a good paper I read a few weeks back that I think I featured when we talked about defensive realism on this channel, that the People's Liberation, naval craft are more so in a defensive posture than they are in an expansive one. And Posen points out in this book that because of China's more of its landmass not being as coastal or access to the ocean as, say, other countries like the US or the United Kingdom, it is more of a land-based country than it is anywhere else, which is why China's been spending a lot of its investments over the last 7 years on the Belt and Road Initiative, working on agreements with India for border security arrangements, working on the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, and are now looking at trying to get access into Iran through Afghanistan. So a lot of interesting things there in regards to China that we've seen over the last 7 years in comparison to when this book was written.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing that I just have to mention real quick on what seems to be a sort of split here between the offensive realists and the defensive realists. Obviously, if you're seeing containment, that's more of a offensive realist position. And I'm not necessarily, I mean, all of these things in regards to Taiwan and Japan and the United States doing those things with special forces and increasing their military preparation, that's all pretty much par for the course. That's just kind of stuff that we do. So that's not really a surprise to hear that. I mean, especially given what happened in Hong Kong. So my one thing as a sort of little because I'm not even sure whether I'm necessarily an offensive or defensive realist myself. I would just like to point out the pros and the cons of offensive and defensive realism here in this context. So if you're going to make a containment strategy, you just have to understand that has the risk of increasing hostility and raising the temperature, right? Especially if you're going to attempt to do it in a stealthy manner and you get caught. However, if you just say, okay, China, you're going to do your thing, and you run the risk of basically saying, okay, Taiwan means nothing to us, and go ahead and invade China. So I don't know. I feel like the Taiwanese really are in a rock and a hard place here. It's in the United States' ideological interest to fight over Taiwan. However, as I think we both would agree that it's not necessarily the United States' strategic or material interest to fight over Taiwan. But as a symbol of, pro-capitalist China or pro-capitalist West, the symbol of Taiwan is something that would have to be considered here.
And you see that a lot from the foreign policy establishment when they talk about human rights and democracy. I always bring in the Schmidt quote about humanity being a tool to conduct inhumanities on your enemies. And I always say replace humanity with either human rights or democracy. And here we are. I always love that little bit from Moldbug on Tucker Carlson, where he's like, talk to any of these foreign policy guys in the State Department and ask them what's the difference between global leadership and global domination, and just watch them sputter. And
world domination. Yeah, that I love that quote too. That's a great one. That's pretty much. I mean the issue of Taiwan. We'll see what happens here with them, but I'm of the opinion that China eventually will make a grab for them when they feel that the United States isn't able to or willing to defend them. So we'll see what happens.
The other issue to consider, of course, would be its political infiltration. The crackdown in Hong Kong serves as a very excellent model for what they could do with Taiwan, especially as there are reunification parties inside Taiwan's government that, of course, can play a role there about getting social and cultural capitulation. But let's see here.
Right.
Yeah. Dave does have a point in the chat.
Okay, we're switching.
I wanted to address here. He says the UN is trying to push a human rights policy that would mean they can do anything in the name of climate change, a right for a safe and environment. And I mean, that doesn't surprise me, right? Think about the idea of Wilson saying that about going into World War I for the United States, that we must engage in this war to pursue and to find a world to not only make it safe for democracy, but to ensure a perpetual peace. And that's what it sounds like to me right there when it comes to environmentalism. I think that environmentalism in the future, as you're seeing it now, will be the new sort of human rights and democracy. Because in this weird religiosity that we see from the left and in the liberal left is that climate change is like their eschatology. And they will double down on it when their predictions about, no ice caps win or no ice on the Kilimanjaro mountains, like Al Gore had talked about. It's like anytime that a fundamentalist Christian group will say that the end of the world for Revelation is, Judgment Day is predicted to be XYZ date on 20-something. And when that day passes and they get it wrong, they double down. And we're seeing the same thing essentially happen here.
Right. And that's just yet another connection between, I guess you would say, radical Protestantism and the modern left. It's so uncanny. Once you see these things, then you just see all of these little connections all over the place, and that includes the millenarianism that you see everywhere. So I just have one thing to say to Flack here. He had a point about a few minutes ago. He says the other problem with the paper tiger analysis. Oh, hold on, that's not the one. He says, not sure how you get around the fact that all Chinese companies are state-aligned, but everything in the U.S. is private. Well, yes, actually, but that's one of the challenges that the United States has an ostensibly capitalist power has to deal with when you're fighting against a power like China, which is much more centralized and much more managerial in comparison anyway. I know all of us are probably Burnhamites and think that the United States is a managerial power in and of itself, but ostensibly that is a question that will have to be answered here: is how effective is your system going to be compared to our system? So,
I mean, the other thing about China, right, that I think always needs to be discussed is its absolute infiltration of institutions in the West. Whether it's Confucius centers or the number of American professors that get caught leaking information to the Chinese, or even to the point where even this year, you had Stanford University begging the Biden administration to stop investigating Stanford for giving technology and information to the Chinese, despite the fact that Stanford has had multiple instances of that very thing happening. Something which, policy hawks
right,
and
and
China
also,
analysis talk about.
yeah, and of course, don't forget the traditional. I mean, you talked about cyber earlier, but don't forget the traditional espionage stuff as well, and that's especially true in things like industrial espionage. Um, China has a very interesting strategy where it does not prefer to really do R&D for itself. It really, really likes to just basically free ride off of somebody else's technological research and development, and then like reverse engineer everything. So it's fascinating how they choose to operate like that. I find that culturally extremely distinct and disconcerting, really.
Yeah, it reminds me of what Bronze Age Pervert has always talked about in regards to China, that China has always been more imitative than it has been innovative. And that if the United States were really serious about either containment or, mitigating the advancement of Chinese military technology, you would have an immediate crackdown on espionage and intelligence. Because if you look at China's military resources and forces right now, you are either copying off old Soviet tech, or you are literally building fifth and sixth generation like fighter planes based on American designs. It's so blatant that, I mean, you would. Yeah, that's all I can really say there. Is just
Yeah,
blatant.
yeah. I mean, the fifth generation fighter, right? I mean, go look at American fifth generation fighter aircraft, and then go look at the Russian and especially Chinese equivalents, and it looks like an almost exact carbon copy, and that's something that has been commented before in military circles. They're like, well, they got that. I mean, who knows how effective those things will actually be in combat? But yeah, yeah. One thing
Well,
also on the weapons, I just have to say, on the Soviet technology, right? The Soviet tech, even though it's relatively old, right, and it's probably starting to show its age in terms of its operational capability and the ability to actually operate for extended periods out at sea. They have very dangerous weaponry from the Soviet period. Like, it's nothing to turn up your nose at. Like the Sovereign DDG is fairly considered fairly dangerous for an aging weapons platform. The Kilo submarine is very, very dangerous, even though it's diesel. Like, people I see a lot of people on Twitter poo-pooing diesel submarines. Well, okay, the thing you have to remember about a diesel sub is it has very severe weapons limitations, but it's very good as an ambush hunter because it's very, very quiet. So if you were, say, to put what I would expect people would do is to put their submarines in strategic choke points, right? Whereas everybody would put something as an ambush hunter in a strategic choke point. It's just very tactically sound as an option. So I mean, think like Straits of Malacca, Gibraltar, all of these different places across the world that you could like choke off somebody's shipping, right? So that would be, I mean, diesel subs, littoral attack craft, says Flack. I mean, kind of. I mean, the Chinese have their own versions of littoral attack craft and things that they've gotten from the Russians or copied from the Russians. So I mean, it's they have their place, but mostly I would expect them to put them in places that are where they could affect attacks on shipping.
They also make good littoral craft in part due to how much they would have to resurface. Just their depth length of time to be underwater, I think, plays a role there. Strategically, you could definitely play them off as a littoral craft. But as we've passed our 1 hour and 30-minute mark, I know that we've been talking about warfare capabilities and technology. I think that this allows us to just offer our final thoughts, and that way I can shill for you and explain what you're doing, what you're writing about, and we can let people know what we're going to be up to in the next couple of weeks. So, final thoughts, Mandrill, on the book?
Yeah, sure. Yes, this is an excellent book. You should definitely pick it up if you have any interest in foreign policy or what an actual sane foreign policy for the United States would look like. So yeah, go ahead and go buy it, go read it. There's one other book that I think that if you're interested in naval combat or naval strategy that you should read. Considering that Barry Posen has a very prominent picture of naval craft on the front of his book. You should probably pick up the book 100 Days by Admiral Sandy Woodward. I don't know if I've mentioned that on stream before. I know I've mentioned some people on Twitter. But that's also an excellent book because Admiral Woodward was the strike group commander or British equivalent, basically, in the Falklands War. And if you want to understand kind of how a modern naval conflict would look like, you probably should go read that. It has some very interesting insights.
Yes, and along with that, I would recommend not only picking up this book, as we've talked about, but I would also recommend Haas's Foreign Policy Begins at Home. It was written at the same time, so you can kind of get an idea of what this consensus of looking inward at the United States looked like at the time. But there's a lot by Kenneth Waltz that I would strongly suggest that you read. And the most specific one, let me pull it up so I get it's called Man, the State in War. It really breaks down a lot about how war operates, how it operates between states, and how its impact on populations. And it's a good way to look at what modern conflict would look like. So, I mean, if you want to get an understanding of where, Posen's influences come from, Man, the State in War by Kenneth Waltz, I think is absolutely essential reading to get a more classical as well as defensive realist understanding in foreign policy. But with all that being said, Mr. Mandrill, is there anything that you would like to share?
Yes, actually. I do have a Substack account that I post rather infrequently to, and I also have my YouTube channel. You can also find me on Twitter and also on the alternative platforms as well, such as, so if you want to look at my YouTube stuff, I do have plenty of ideas for content. I'm not sure when I'm going to get time to do that, but eventually here I will be putting out some more content on YouTube and things like that. So.
And I have his links in the description.
Thank you, Dave, for putting that little link there for us at the bottom for Kenneth Walt's book. So,
yeah, and I have it up on screen for you all. So Mr. Mandrill has his links in the description for his YouTube channel, his Twitter, and you can find his Substack there as well on the links in his bio. So yeah, and he's got plans to put a lot more. I know that he has told me, and I'm sure he doesn't mind sharing his plans here, but I know that he's planning to go back to school and work with the Mises Institute and start really learning and hitting the books, what we call doing the work. And there we go. So Mr. Mandrill's links are in the description.
Yep. And like everybody else, I have a stack of books that's probably a skyscraper tall by now, but anyway.
But yes, and for me, my links, of course, are in the description. If I wanted to thank Mr. BK for becoming a new channel member. Thank you so much. You'll have access to videos early, as well as a monthly community sort of gaming stream stuff that I'm planning on working on my gaming PC. The game in question is still being decided by all the patrons, but by all means, you can, comment away, or I can post a post about what you guys are interested in. But those are some of the perks, as well as certain patrons can also have access to, coming on for an episode of the Sunday stream talking about a foreign policy topic that is of their interest and ideas for future videos. So any support that you guys want to give, whether it's through memberships or through Subscribe Star, you guys help make sure that my medical bills are paid and my anti-rejection medicine is kept cheap, and I am ever indebted to you guys for that. So I'm very thankful for that, and I can't express my gratitude enough. But as for future announcements, this Sunday stream is going to be on the cost efficiency puzzle of war, which goes in tandem with last week's discussion over the bargaining model of war. And after this tonight, I will be hopefully finishing up the audio edits that I needed to in order to get this video on the modern horror movie genre out and talking about, realistic horror, analog horror, and things like that. I think it'll be a very fun discussion to just talk about entertainment for a bit and how it relates to our current political environment. And after that, I'm going to have a little how-to guide for my Substack recorded for you all to enjoy next week while I work on some longer projects as well in regards to masculinity and politics. So, Mandrill, I can't begin to express my thanks enough for coming on, but also for thanking you to recommend this book to me. I'm very thankful for that. And for all of you in the chat, I hope that you enjoyed this recommendation and enjoyed our conversation on this book. And I wish you all a good evening, good morning, and good night. Be prudent, everybody, and I'll see you next time.
Good night, everybody.